Hello and good afternoon to you all. This is the first attempt to have a live stream, a live broadcast from the Netherlands, from Annapolona, where I live in the top of north of Holland, the North Holland province. And I'm the founder of Hegelcourses.com. You can find us at Hegelcourses.wordpress.com. And my aim is to provide teaching about the philosophy of Hegel, especially in this year, well, at least the upcoming months, and the start of next year. So it's a project that will take a couple of months to introduce you to the philosophy of spirit. We talked about philosophy of right. I didn't finish that. I had some videos on dialectic method and all of that. But there are a couple of people who are working with me, and they prefer to talk about the philosophy of spirit, which I find a brilliant idea, because in the philosophy of spirit we find topics like romantic art, the end of art, the meaning of religion, in particular Christian religion, what is the meaning of Christianity for philosophy, and we will talk about the idea of philosophy itself, absolute knowledge. That's our ultimate goal. You're reading part of the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, the 1831 edition. We're going to read it in German, we're going to read it in English. Now, the system works like this. I have videos explaining the text, and I have live broadcast in which you can ask your questions, in which we will discuss the same topics that I dealt with in these little videos. We also have, that is not for today, but we will also have little interviews and discussions between me and 1, 2, or maybe 3 participants. So that will be also in the live sessions, and my proposal is to have these live sessions on Thursday afternoon, my time, and maybe if it turns out that not many of you can attend these live sessions, we can move to another day. Well, today is just the experiment, so I wasn't expecting anyone to be here. And as I can tell on my screen, the top left, there's no one watching this live. That's okay. The experiment is mainly for me to see how this would work, and to see if the program that I'm using for this, StreamYard, actually works okay. You can find me on YouTube, as you probably did right now if you are here, and you can find me on Facebook. There is a Facebook page devoted to Hegelcourses.wordpress.com. So announcements about upcoming videos, announcements about the live sessions you can find there. You can see everything that is going on that Facebook page. There's also a website, and that website is, of course, hegelcourses.wordpress.com. And on that website, you will find blog posts, um, you will find the videos, you will find the audios, because there's also a Spreaker channel, Spreaker.com, and on Spreaker.com there is one Hegel channel, and on that Hegel channel I will try to post as many audio files as possible. So a lot of media are involved here, and they all have a separate function. So the live streams is to engage with you in direct conversation. The website is to gather everything into one place. The Facebook page is to build a little community of people who are interested in Hegel. And there is the YouTube for the videos and the live sessions. So that's it. Today I just wanted to talk a little bit about the reason behind Hegelcourses.com, Hegelcourses.wordpress.com. In short, Hegel courses. What is behind all of that? Why do I like to make that? I'm not a professional philosopher. That is to say, I'm not teaching at some institution. So that makes me an amateur philosopher, maybe. I do have a philosophical education. I studied philosophy at the University of Amsterdam, starting in 1988. And I did theology on the side, that was my minor. And I did Semitic languages, that was my second minor. But my main field of interest was philosophy. And then I came back to the university and finished my philosophy studies with a dissertation. And I also finished my theology studies. So that defines my field of interest. I'm interested in theology, biblical theology, the explanation of biblical texts in Hebrew and Greek. I'm interested in rabbinics, the Jewish philosophy and Jewish literature. And I'm interested in the history of philosophy. That's why Hegel is part of my field of interest. Now, Hegel became the most important one. Let me tell you about that a little bit. Because in the year before I went to university, a friend of mine and I started reading Hegel. We had learned from books like Sturich, History of Philosophy, that Hegel was particularly difficult and that he was maybe particularly ridiculous exactly because of his concept of the spirit, because of this so-called absolute idealism, because of this childish dialectics, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Seems like a very inappropriate method. So we started reading Hegel because we were interested in Heidegger, who had studied Hegel, and we were interested in Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, who was one of the great critics of Hegel. And of course, we were interested in Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Heidegger. Those were the three topics, three philosophers that we were most interested in. And all three of them seemed to make it necessary to understand a little bit of Hegel. Okay, so we started reading Hegel. We bought the Phenomenology of Spirit, or the Phenomenology of Mind, as I think most English translations will have it. And we started reading the preface, the Voorrede, the preface. And we found out that it's not like an ordinary preface, it's filled with philosophical arguments and discussions about Hegel's methods and why Hegel wanted to do things differently, and we had no idea what it meant. The only thing I can remember from those first encounters with Hegel, so the preface that we were reading, are things like Substanz muss Geist werden. Substance needs to become spirit. No idea. We knew what substance meant because we had read Spinoza, but that was all. So we gave up on Hegel. And then I started at the University of Amsterdam with my studies in philosophy, and Hegel wasn't anywhere in sight. Well, there was a little introduction from a professor that taught 19th century philosophy. Maarten van Dierop was his name, and he ridiculed Hegel. He was more into Schopenhauer and other philosophers of the 19th century. But these early 19th century philosophers like Hegel, like Reinhold, like Jacobi, like Fichte, like Schelling, he didn't like those guys at all. So for him, philosophy became interesting after, say, the death of Hegel, with post-Hegelian philosophy after 1835. But the little bit that he told us about Hegel did trigger my interest again. So in my second year at the university, I was particularly pleased to meet the most important teacher in my life, which was Kees Jan Brons, of blessed memory. He died last year in November. And he was a teacher that really introduced me into Hegel. And he explained a little bit of this preface. And it turned out that this preface was really interesting, especially if you looked at Hegel and looked at Kant, Immanuel Kant at the same time. If you saw the connections between Kant and Hegel, which, by the way, was his great topic and the topic of his dissertation. So now, all of a sudden, Hegel became important because of his logic, his theory of concepts and how concepts were interrelated and how they, well, almost were active, alive. So we started reading the Science of Logic, and I started gradually to understand a little bit. And this teacher, Kees Jan Brons, had a special group of students, fourth, fifth year students, and I was invited to take part in that. And what I heard was so complicated, but I really got a desire to learn to understand all of that, because somehow it seemed to me that there was something very important going on. So I continued reading Hegel and listening to teachers like Jan Hollack in Amsterdam, who was a great professor there teaching Hegel. I never got really close to him, but he was I think the greatest philosopher at that time. Even other professors of philosophy attended his lectures. So there was Jan Hollack, and Jan Hollack was the main teacher of Kees Jan Brons, who became my teacher and friend later on. Now, what is so interesting and important about Hegel, I made a couple of videos trying to explain that. Well, first of all, Hegel, of course, is the culmination of classical Western philosophy. He is the high point. So after Hegel, philosophers turned away from the inclination to build large systems that could explain the whole of reality. Leibniz, Kant, Wolff, Descartes, all of modern philosophy took a very specific turn, you might say the turn to subjectivity, trying to understand subjectivity in a very special way as a primary principle of reality. So epistemology became important. And in that trajectory between, let's say, Descartes as the father of the modern era in philosophy, Hegel is absolutely the culmination. He is like the completed Descartes and the completed David Hume and the completed Kant, because he takes all these elements of previous philosophies and puts them together, weaves them together like threads in a tapestry. So that is one of the things you can say about Hegel in a sort of from a historical perspective. that he's the culmination of these previous traditions and philosophers. And then there is something else, and that has to do with what happened after Hegel. Now, it turns out that most philosophers after Hegel were unable to set up, to structure their own philosophies without turning back to Hegel and first ask the question, did Hegel have some kind of resolution for this or that problem? What did Hegel say? That has become a question that you need to ask before trying to find your own voice in your own system. And that is not just true for the second part of the 19th century, it's true for the 20th century as well. And we might not see that immediately because we got the phenomenological movement with Scheler and Merleau-Ponty and Husserl and Brentano and all of these guys. And then after the Second World War, you get the influence of Sartre and Heidegger. And they were not simply Hegel lovers. They were not neo-Hegelians. But you also had in France Courgève, who was a Marxist. People who were infatuated with Marxism, with Karl Marx's work, understood that Karl Marx would be unintelligible without referring back to his great teacher, which is, of course, Hegel. So, in the aftermath of Hegel's death, culture changed a lot, society changed a lot, philosophy changed a lot, science, especially natural sciences, came to their current blossoming, if I can say it like that. But all of them needed to go back to Hegel. Even in psychology, you get Jacques Lacan, who read Hegel. You get Slavoj Žižek, who reads Hegel and wrote one of the most magnificent books about Hegel. What's his name again? Less Than Nothing. Less Than Nothing. It's a great book about, among other things, Hegelian philosophy. So Hegel as the culmination of previous philosophies, and Hegel as the starting point of a whole series of responses to Hegel, starting with Karl Marx and Søren Kierkegaard, with other elements of the culture that seem to contradict Hegel, like Freud and the psychoanalytic movement. Still, there were echoes of Hegel in their work. Still, there were issues that they were dealing with that Hegel had dealt with before. For instance, in his philosophy of right, the whole idea of what it means to have a liberal society. And what does liberty mean? It's almost impossible to talk about liberty and freedom and the structure of society without first looking at Hegel. I mean, you could easily dispense with Hume or with Descartes or with medieval philosophy, but it turned out to be quite impossible to do any kind of philosophy without referring back to Hegel. That's the second major reason. The third reason, of course, is the contents of the work. Now, there is a negative and a positive side to that. When I refer to the contents, one of the challenges of reading Hegel is that his work is so fantastically complex. I mean, the complexity of his sentences, we will take one dive into one text just to show to you how difficult it actually is. It's like a challenge. I would call that the negative attachment to or negative challenge of Hegel. He's difficult, so let's try to crack the code. Well, it turns out that in the attempt to understand these complex German sentences, that you sometimes also gain an understanding of it. And so that's the positive side. That maybe apart from Husserl and Heidegger, I know of no philosopher that has so systematically worked at the problems at hand. There's a famous expression by Heidegger, used in one of his letters to an obnoxious student, actually. The student sent Heidegger a little essay, and the essay was full of quotations from Heidegger and semi-deep statements. So Heidegger wrote back, lernen Sie die harte Arbeit des Begriffes. So learn the harte Arbeit, what is that? The complex, the difficult, the heavy labor of the concept. Really trying to understand something, not being able to put different concepts and words together in a sentence that looks like something, but to really understand the depth of a concept and to be able to really clarify that concept. That is something that Heidegger told his student that he had to learn. Well, really, if you want to learn these harte Arbeit des Begriffes, and this hard labor of the concept, well, turn to Hegel, especially to the science of logic. Then there is a fourth reason to deal with Hegel, and that has to do with the fact that Hegel's entire philosophy can be seen from two sides. You see commentators choosing either one or the other of these approaches. One school of followers or students of Hegel has said the entirety of Hegel's philosophy is like one demonstration of the existence of God. It has the shape of an argument for the existence of God. By explaining everything within reality and the interconnectedness of everything within reality, the totality of reality is actually put forward, and that whole is subjectivity, i.e., spirit, i.e., God. So that's more like a theological approach to Hegel's work. And then there's the other side, which was represented, for instance, by my teachers in Amsterdam, Jan Hollack, and to a lesser extent, Kees-Jan Brons. But Jan Hollack maintained in his own dissertation about the phenomenology of spirit, he maintained that the whole of Hegel's philosophy is actually a philosophy of history. Now, that's interesting, because the theological perspective might mean that Hegel tried to give absolute statements about the absolute that would be valid forever. But the philosophy of history approach meant that Hegel tries to understand the principles on which all cultural movements in his era were based. He tries to elucidate the principles of their development and tries to look at also their future, because he maintains that the spirit is something that develops over time and in time. So the history of humanity and the history of philosophy and the history of our social institutions actually show and demonstrate the inner content of the absolute spirit. Well, if that is the case, you don't get statements that are absolute and valid forever. You get statements that are valid and important for the era in which Hegel himself lived, which is let's say, the end of the era of enlightenment and the start of a new era in philosophy, which is sometimes referred to as the beginning of the anthropocentric era. And so before Hegel's death, we have theocentric philosophy, trying to understand the divine. That is true for Descartes, not so much for Hume. That is true for Kant to some extent. And it's certainly true for Hegel. We can look at it from that perspective. But the other hand is that Hegel only wanted to understand his own era. And his own era, therefore, is the Age of Enlightenment before you get this anthropocentric turn in the middle of the 19th century. All of this has complications attached to it. What does it mean, this anthropocentric turn? And is Hegel really theocentric? And how did he actually view the future of philosophy and the future of human culture after this era of what he called the Christian Germanic world? Questions and questions and questions. And that is, again, a reason, the sixth reason, that makes Hegel so interesting. He seems to be like the middle of a spider's web, and everywhere you go, you are attached to this center, this middle of the entire web. Whatever you catch, whatever you understand in that web, it manifests itself as coming out of this center or this middle of the web. Sixth reason, therefore, to take a look at Hegel. For me personally, Hegel became also important because he was like the other side of religious thought. Either because he criticized that kind of thinking, that is possible, or because he actually gave a foundation for religious thought. He made us understand what in theology might be expressed in a very different way, but according to his own statement in the encyclopedia, theology and philosophy both are sciences that deal with the absolute, but in different ways. Philosophy tries to understand religion and its object, and religion tries to carve out a way of existing in a relationship to this absolute. And it has an implicit knowledge of the absolute as well in order for it to function like that. And philosophy might need a religious practice in order to be really embodied in a human being. That's how Hegel tries to reflect on the relationship between philosophy and religion. All of that made him quite important to me. Now, I didn't continue on my path in philosophy. I also read Levinas, who is a very important critic of Hegel. Actually, I read Theodor Adorno. I read Edmund Husserl. I engaged with many other philosophies, Jacobi, for instance. I can go on mentioning names, Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. I read many things in my life, and Zizek is one of the last great philosophers that I'm interested in. But Hegel remains somewhere in my thinking, somewhere in the center of my thinking. I did not become a philosopher. I became a theologian, and a practicing theologian. I became a minister of the Protestant Church because I was concerned with this way of existing on the basis of religious understanding of the world, way more than just a theory of it. And yeah, sometimes life gives you a particular road that you can go on, and it closes off other roads. And for me, the path of theology was opened, and the path of philosophy was closed. So I became a theologian, which did not mean that I lost my interest in philosophy. Now, that is the reason that especially now, I've been doing this for a couple of years already, but especially now that I'm retired and have all the spare time in the world, that I wanted to pick up where I left off. I want to go back to Hegel, and I like teaching, and I like having interaction with students. So that is the reason that we do it in public, that I do it in public with some other people that are involved. And the most important of those people is Ivana. You can find her on the YouTube channel giving a little endorsement for the Hegelcourses program. But she and I are doing most of the work here. Let's give you one sense of what it means to read Hegel. Let's go to a little text and see if you can understand what that is all about. Okay, now this is a paragraph that I have also made a video of. You can find that on my YouTube channel. You can find it on the website. And for those of you who have missed it, Hegelcourses.wordpress.com. That's the website that is connected to everything I do here. So the third section of the philosophy of spirit is about the absolute spirit. You can see it here in the English translation. Part 3 of the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, and then the introduction, but we are somewhere else. This is about philosophy of right. We have to move on a little bit and then we come, I think, to this. Oh, this is still, yeah, here, the absolute mind. So we can go back and forth between the German text and the English text here. That's what I do. I always want to show you the German text and explain also the German text. I think it's important to understand that Hegel did not write this English version of his own thinking. And there are so many differences between German and English, German way of thinking within and because of its language is really different from the English way of thinking. But let's go back then to the German text. Now you can find an explanation of 553 in my YouTube channel. You can find an explanation of 554 also in the YouTube channel. But I wanted to make a little bit, I wanted to make some little comments on this text here. You see here, there's a difference here. The text here is written by Hegel himself. The text here is probably all of them written by his students, collected and published in most versions of the encyclopedia. So this is what some students have written down of Hegel's own remarks. Now he says here something that is, I think, interesting. So I'm going to read from here to here. So let's first dive into the German so that you get an inkling of how difficult the text actually is. Des heutigen Tags so wenig von Gott gewusst und bei seinem objektiven Wesen sich aufgehalten, desto mehr aber von Religion, das ist dem Inwohnen desselben in der subjektiven Seite, gesprochen und sie, nicht die Wahrheit als solche gefordert wird, enthält wenigstens diese richtige Bestimmung, dass Gott als Geist in seiner Gemeinde aufgefasst werden muss. So what does this mean? Let's try and find out. Oh, that goes too fast. So, final sentence here. If nowadays there is so little consciousness of God, note, consciousness of God is not the same as positive religion, and it's not the same as the various religions that we have. It's not an object of the science of religion, but consciousness of God. And his objective essence is so little dwelt upon that people don't talk about what and who is God. They approach the notion of God from within a certain tradition, from within a certain praxis, religious praxis, and that's what they do. And the reason for that he gives here, while people speak so much more of the subjective side of religion, that is how I experience it, how my consciousness works, i.e. of God's indwelling in us, which is a typical, neo-Christian, I would almost say, a post-Christian way of talking about God. God is within you, and you are a God unto yourself. God is a word for, well, some kind of interest, some kind of vision, some kind of self-relation that people might have. God's indwelling in us, and if that and not the truth as such is called for, because that is the case here in this little consciousness of God, no thinking about his objective essence, but only People speak about the subjective side of religion and think that they are speaking about God when they do that, which is not the case, of course, he says. Uh, in this attention to the subjective side of religion, there is at least the correct principle that God must be apprehended as spirit in his community. God must be apprehended as spirit in his community. Also, a very important element of his phenomenology of spirit, where in the chapter of religion you have Father, Son, Holy Spirit, the Trinitarian structure here, and that the philosophy of, or the theology of the Spirit is the point of transition toward philosophy proper, which is the understanding of the Spirit as such. Or, to put it in his words here, that's the understanding of the essence of God, not just the subjective side. So, what he finds in religion is very different from what people in everyday life understand by the word religion. Religion is um, some kind of indwelling of God in us, some kind of relationship to something spiritual outside of you that you cannot deny, um, something that you experience, maybe also, if you're a religious person, you experience that in the community to which you belong, which has these traditions and understandings and principles and axioms and practices that you participate in. And that is the way you exercise um, your religious consciousness, your consciousness of God. This gives him the opportunity in another book, which is called Philosophy of Religion, um, to expand on this and try to explain how the cult and the practices, etc., how they convey a certain understanding of who God is. It allows him to speak about what he calls the culmination of all religion, which to him was Christianity, even though that was not the final appearance of monotheistic religion, of course, that was Islam. Um, Again, a lot of problems here in his philosophy of religion. Why didn't he give the Islam, uh, which came later, a position of the culmination of the three religions? Why is it? I mean, Islam seems to be sort of synthesis between Judaism and Christianity, formally at least. But again, when we get to that point, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And because formally, he had to say actually that Islam is the synthesis of Judaism and Christianity, but he didn't. So why didn't he do that? What did he see in Islam that didn't live up to um, this status of being the synthesis of Judaism and Christianity? Why did he say that Christianity was the synthesis of all previous religions and that Judaism and Islam were merely two subordinate forms of that religion? That's a choice he made. And maybe a choice that was given to him or suggested to him by the importance of especially the Lutheran or Protestant religion in his particular era. But now that we are past that era, we passed Hegel mortuum after Hegel's death. That's how important his death is as a mark for the beginning of a totally new way of thinking, a totally new culture. So at least this principle implies that you have to look at the community of the Spirit. What is the religious community like? Because God is within humanity, and that is for the first time, let's say, apparent in the way God is mentioned as the pivotal point, or the focal point, rather, the focal point of a community. When we come to the chapter of religion, in the course of our dealing with all of these paragraphs, we will have a reason to connect with that already. But this is a typical, quite difficult Hegelian sentence. And it's something that he might have said during his lectures. It doesn't have the same structure as sentences that he uses in the encyclopedia itself, where all these technical terms are um, quite active and quite prominent. That's something else that we're going to do on Hegel courses. We're going to explain these words, word like absolute, in sich zijnde, being within itself. What does it mean that it returns into or unto itself? What does identity mean? What does substance mean? You can see in the first three lines you have absolute, being in itself, returning in itself, and identity are four words that need explanation just in the first two lines of this paragraph. Okay, we're nearing the end. I have just one more remark to make. In order to understand Hegel, you must really exert yourself. The Anstrengung des Begriffes. So the exertion, the application, the commitment to read Hegel, to understand Hegel. Now, what is the profit of that? What does it profit you to start reading Hegel? I think two things at least. First of all, you'll learn a philosophical language which is complex, yes, but is also very wide. In Hegel's terminology, almost everything can be said. That is not true of a system like that of John Locke. You can't say that everything that you need to specify and think about and analyze can be explained in his terminology. But in Hegel's terminology, there's ample reason to say that that is the universal language of philosophy to a certain extent. Secondly, Hegel will give you food for thought almost in every line, every sentence that he speaks. That means that you have to go through Hegel slowly. We do it one paragraph at a time. I'm not interested in giving you overviews. I'm not interested in giving you the whole picture, apart from helping you to define the specific place of something within the whole system, which is part of its meaning. So the overview is not to be the replacement of this close reading, this analytical reading of the text, but it should be nothing but an aid in understanding the intricacies and the details of Hegel's system. What are the questions that you might struggle with yourself? There's one very interesting idea that opens the philosophy of spirit, first paragraph of that section, and that is this statement, that actually in the philosophy of spirit, ultimately it's the answer to the question, who am I? When I ask the question, who am I? Then Hegel's philosophy of spirit is the answer to that. Not in the sense that it answers the question, what I am in my personal and individual existence as such, for myself and for others, but it gives me tools to understand who I am as a European in the 21st century, with all the baggage of my traditions and whatever happened to Christianity, etc., etc., etc. Now, Hegel can help me understand my own being up to the emergence of the new era in 1835. But it gives me the tools to try and understand what happens after that. What happened with art after 1835? What happened to religion in the 20th century? What happened to the relationship between states after the Second World War? What happened to our system of government, turning to the philosophy of right, after 1835, after 1940, after the election of Donald Trump in 2024? Hegel is an enormous aid to bring about what is necessary and what he asks us to do to bring about our own philosophy, our own understanding. And that's a very good reason to study Hegel, because Hegel will allow you to understand, to learn to understand, to learn to build a philosophical understanding of the totality of reality, not just a part, not just that single thing that you are focused upon, which happens so many times in 20th century philosophies. And that there is one phenomenon, one idea, one single thing that is used as the key to all of reality without considering the specific character of different regions of reality. Hegel does that. Hegel brings art and religion, natural sciences, categories of mechanics, being and nothingness, so logic, philosophy of nature, and philosophy of the spirit. He brings it together in one single vision and shows the interconnectedness of these fields of inquiry and the interconnectedness of the concepts that are used throughout that whole endeavor. That is why I think studying Hegel is so important. But finally, it's fun. It's fun to study Hegel because there's always a puzzle. There's always something that requires your analytic ability to, and will test that ability to the utmost and trying to figure out what Hegel means. And then you will also understand that Hegel could not have said it differently just to please us and to be more simple to read. He says it like that because in his writing and in his thinking, he tries to follow the inner dynamic of the concept itself. And that's important enough to repeat. So the complexity of Hegel's writing is the result of his attempt to follow the intricate movements of the concept itself. Of course, that needs explanation. Of course, that needs demonstration. But it might be something that triggers in you the desire to study Hegel. Well, I'm here to assist you in that, not as the expert, not as a second Hegel, but as one who has been studying Hegel now for more than 50 years. Thank you for listening to this broadcast. This is the first. I'm going to take a look at the stream to see if it's worth the effort. And if so, we'll be back next week around this time. I'm not exactly sure when. Could be an hour earlier, could be even an hour later. But take a look at the YouTube site and you will find out when we are back again. Okay, thank you very much and see you next week.